Okay, hello.
Hi, Penny. How are you?
Good.
Oh, Mitch,
Of course, the dog.
Hi, Ray.
how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Say hello to the dog. Every time we get on the computer, she's like a 2-year-old. She's got to be here. It's unbelievable.
Photobomb. Is it he or she?
She.
Yeah. Does she photobomb your pictures too?
No. I somehow the phone and everything and the camera's okay, but the computer, I don't know whether it's the noise or whatever. The minute we do that for any reason, Skyping with the girls or whatever, she's got to be right here.
We have to take all our toys away because she's gonna want to play and we don't want to play. Where's the big BAO?
Kind of like having the kid back in the house.
Yeah. This is, vaguely familiar with,
Except she probably doesn't keep a lot of stuff in your basement or your attic. So
yeah, and we can send her to the kennel or tie her up outside, which you can't do with kids too, too easily anyway.
Oh.
Hi, Diane.
hi, Diane.
Hi, how are you?
How are you?
Good.
Ran over from work, so I'm out of breath. So are the kids coming home for Christmas break?
We have Emily with us now. She got here, she's teleworking. So we have to accommodate her schedule, but she'll be teleworking with us for a month.
Tell her I said hi.
Yeah, I think she's
Hey.
shopping right now.
A retired federal employee greets her.
Yes. Something about year-end things. They can't do anything till the budget is finally finalized by the Congress, and heaven knows when that's going to be. So
Yeah, usually at least in DOD, you operate on a continuing resolution. that
yes,
just goes,
well, they've already
goes on forever and ever and ever.
yeah. It's like February 3rd or something. So she figured she could, nothing big was going to happen, so she might as well, get a train ride when it was cheap.
Slept in.
Sure.
Cheaper, yeah.
Anita, how are you?
Good, and you, everybody?
Hi, Helen.
Hi.
How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing. It's another busy Monday.
COVID-19, but hospital patients are still rising a lot. 60 more people were admitted over the weekend, bringing the total number of COVID-19 patients in the hospital to 645. Governor Ned
I think Helen's news or something. I think she just muted herself.
Mary and my sister Edna are joining us. And here's Carol. Hi, Carol.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
So the light's not. So you can do that for the moment.
Show them our Christmas tree, Mary.
Well, it's not lit on the top because I couldn't figure out how to plug that part in.
Oh.
So I don't think we'll show half it. It's It's a very lovely tree. Okay, that's the part that's lit.
Very nice.
Deanna coming home?
Deanna,
Yeah, is she coming for Christmas or?
day of and after, the in-laws won the coin toss.
Yeah, I have to negotiate those things now.
Yeah, so we'll see them both for the second part of the time they're here.
Well, Christmas lasts till Epiphany, you know.
Yes, the
True.
fact that they've made it at all, I think, is an accomplishment. Is Dave joining us?
I haven't heard that he wasn't. Hi, Janet.
I
You're not driving.
no, I just made it home. Safe and
Where are
sound.
you right now?
I'm in my house
Connecticut.
upstairs in Connecticut. Yeah. in my
Oh, okay. I
house.
was just wondering what state you're in.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm feeling really good about sitting still for a couple of weeks. So,
Okay. I don't know if everybody's figured this out, but just to make sure you know, when you go on YouTube and you find the video, and the videos have all been at least posted all videos, you don't need to sit through the first 5 minutes or so of like silence or chit chat. There's a little button down at the bottom you can advance, so you can skip all that stuff if you're so inclined.
Are all of them still up there?
Yeah, they'll stay there indefinitely, as far as I know. I mean, what's up on the website is just a link to the YouTube video. And I think that will stay there, I don't know, till YouTube goes away, I guess. Okay. Any questions about Hanukkah? Anything you've heard in the last week that
Figured out how to spell it.
no? Well, there's variations on it actually.
I looked it up in the dictionary. They said it had 2 Ks. I didn't realize it was a double K.
Is it a double N or a single N?
Single N and a double K. Hanukkah is the way it was spelled in the Merriam Dictionary.
So tonight we are starting with Exodus, and we're going to spend some time there. So we have a lecture tonight by Shaye Cohen. Next week it'll be by Christine Hayes. Then we'll go back to Professor Cohen, then Dr. Christine Hayes. So there's a couple of different threads of the story we'll be following, as far as there's the basic story of the Exodus, and then also there's the giving of the law and the covenant and that relationship, which was established at Sinai. And then we actually will go into Deuteronomy, which I think probably will be next year by then. So we're going to wander in the desert for a little while here. And just a reminder, we will have the Monday of 27th off. We will reconvene on the first Monday in January. And I did send the part from Klugel about, if you wanted to read it, about the background about Exodus that he has. So there are any questions? Okay, so let's. Actually, I think it was Janet joined me last time in the middle and it worked. So I think if Dave does join us, we'll be able to get him in. Let's go to share the screen. First I will. Okay, so I've muted everybody. Share the sound. Now we go to share the screen.
We have a special treat today in store. Professor Peter Dermanuelian, my colleague, who is an Egyptologist. So I'm just going to launch today's discussion and today's lecture, and then we'll, for the first critical segment, we'll ask Peter Dermanuelian to tell us all about the Egyptological perspectives on the Exodus from Egypt. So today's assignment was to read the opening chapters, the first half or so of the book of Exodus, which, of course, appropriately enough, describes the Exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Right, so Exodus is two Greek words, ex, out of, and hodos, which means road or path. So exodus is the road, path, out. Perhaps in Latin we might say exit. Exodus being Greek. Okay, so describes the Exodus from Egypt. So I've given you the outline of the first few of the chapters for today. I noticed this morning, to my horror, a serious typo. Mea culpa, mea maxima est culpa. In chapter 2, it says birth of Moses, flight to Egypt. It of course should say flight from Egypt or flight to Midian. Right. So, right. The quality control needs to be heightened here. So I apologize for that. Anyway, seriously. So there's the outline of those opening chapters. The key point to begin as we look at the story as a whole is to remember that the Exodus is one of the two main poles around which much of Israelite theology revolves. We've already seen one pole, that's the creation motif. Right, that the prophets, especially in the book of Job, wisdom literature, well, book of Job anyway, will invoke God the Creator. That the creation of the world by God is one pole or one focal point of Israelite theology and thinking about relationship with God. We think about God, the Creator. That's manifest in the Ten Commandments. When we look at one version of the Ten Commandments, which we'll be looking at next week, which is that the Sabbath day is meant to remind Israelites of God's creative work. Remember, Genesis chapter 1 ends with the Sabbath. The other pole is the Exodus from Egypt. That as Israelites contemplate God's power or God's justice, they are to contemplate the mighty acts of God in the redemption of the Israelites from Egypt. That's not a contradiction, it's simply an alternative pole, an alternative focal point in which many biblical texts see God primarily not in terms of God's creation, but primarily in terms of God's redemption. That you see in the other version of the Ten Commandments, which we'll see next week, right, in which we rest on the Sabbath because the Sabbath day reminds us of the Exodus from Egypt. And similarly, many of the later prophets, notably Jeremiah, right, who is referring to the Israelites after the destruction of the temple and exile to Babylonia, which was in what year, class? 587, 6, right, BCE. So Jeremiah is reassuring the Judeans that there will be a return, that there will be a restoration, and part of his promise is that no longer will you talk about the power of God who took you out of the land of Egypt. You will talk about the power of God, this powerful God who took you out of the land of Babylonia. Right? This will eclipse the prior redemption. So says Jeremiah. Again, thinking that the redemption from Egypt is a clear focal point of Israelite thinking about God and its relationship with God. So you have these two poles. Creation, we've already discussed. Exodus from Egypt. That's the motif for today, and that's what we'll be discussing, though will come up again several times over the next several weeks. The first big point to discuss is the historicity of the Exodus. Did it actually happen? So Professor Kugel in the reading gives you some evidence and discussion back and forth about this. And I, in my lecture notes, have assembled some of that evidence and thrown a few more things. But rather than hear myself talk on this, I'd much rather hear someone who actually knows something, right? And that is our own professor of Egyptology, Professor Peter Dermanuelian, right, who is an expert in all things Egyptological, and will now give us a brief discussion of the Exodus the Exodus Egyptologically considered. Peter.
I think we should have a caption contest to figure out whether the baby's coming out of the shaft or going into the shaft or what's going on. But when you talk about historicity and ground truth and what do we really know about this episode, I think the best thing to do is turn to the ultimate source of scholarly evidence, and that, of course, is Hollywood.
The Lord of hosts will do battle for us. Behold his mighty hand. God opens the sea with the blast of his nostrils. Lead them through the midst of the waters. His will be done. He opens the waters before them, and he bars our way with fire. Let us go from this place. Men cannot fight against a God.
Better to die in battle with a God than live in shame.
Praise God and down into it!
So nothing like a little bombast on a Wednesday morning, right? Just out of curiosity, who's seen this movie, The Ten Commandments? So most of you have not. Well, you've got some interesting viewing ahead of you. Charlton Heston, the ultimate in bombastic actors, great show. My favorite line, Yul Brynner is playing Ramses, by the way. My favorite line in the movie is when Ramses' queen says to him, "Go and bring Moses' blood back on your sword." And he says, "I will, to mingle with your own." To mingle with your own. Love that. So let's get to chronology here and try to get some of the rumors out of the way if we can. Here is simplified Egyptian chronology. You'll never need to take any of my classes if you memorize this slide. And of course, it's a bit superficial here, but basically you have three major, what we call kingdoms in Egyptian history. Those are the red items. The Old Kingdom is the Pyramid Age. Middle Kingdom is slightly different. It's more the high point of Egyptian literature. Pharaohs are having to deal with their officials a lot more democratically, shall we say. The New Kingdom is the period of empire. And in between, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt tend to collapse and fragment and fall apart and then reunite again. So that's your basic layout. If we go to the Old Kingdom, we're at 2600, 2500 BC. And just to dispel some of the readings or some of the WikiLeaks or whatever you might read, the pyramids and the Israelites have nothing to do with each other. Okay, so the whole rumors about Hebrew slaves build the pyramids and all that, we can just wipe that right off the table right now. This, with buy-in to the Pharaoh's legacy as a kind of a national construction project, this is all geared towards a successful afterlife for the king and thereby guaranteeing the prosperity of the nation, etc. So I have a tough time personally believing that this is slave labor. Corvée drafted, yes, maybe some of the Egyptians had better things to do, but this is a native Egyptian undertaking. And no aliens from outer space. I don't know. So the Old Kingdom's out of the way. Middle Kingdom is also not part of our story, although it's always been tempting to try to draw in some of these parallels. This is a Middle Kingdom tomb painting from the middle part of the country, a site called Beni Hassan. And it shows Semitic peoples who are infiltrating in from the northeast into the Delta region. And in fact, they're actually going to fragment and split the country eventually and lead to the end of the Middle Kingdom and what's known as the Second Intermediate Period. This used to be thought of as a great invasion and the Egypt collapse, and it's the first time there's foreign rule. Nowadays, it's a lot more gradual, and it seems that the north and the south parts of the country we're still interacting and trading and functioning, and it might not be quite the sort of violent overthrow that some of your earlier histories will show. But this is a very famous painting. You can see these very un-Egyptian looking peoples with Semitic dress, Semitic costumes, and hairstyles and things coming in on either tribute or trading expeditions. And so that has often been brought in as evidence of this kind of cross-cultural contact. Well, eventually, these rulers of foreign lands, as they're called in Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Hyksos, are ousted from Egypt by a family of Theban princes from here who rise up and oust the Hyksos and send them scurrying back to the Levant. And then the Egyptians decide, hey, this was fun, let's keep going. And so they do what is called Suwesech Tashu, or broaden the borders of Egypt. And so that whole orange shaded area that you get there becomes the imperialist age in Egyptian history, the New Kingdom or Egyptian Empire. And Egypt becomes the superpower of this period. First dealing with the Hurrian kingdoms of the Mitanni, sort of in that area, later against the Hittites from Anatolia. These are the big players of the age. So for our story then, for Exodus, who comes into play? We've ruled out the Old Kingdom, we've ruled out the Middle Kingdom, it's down to the New Kingdom, and these particular pharaohs are the ones who are mentioned, and I've highlighted them in red. Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, played by Yul Brynner, or perhaps his successor, Merneptah. Now, I could cut this very short by saying there's really not a lot of evidence from the Egyptian side, and we could be done. So far I've given you no evidence for the Exodus, right? And I'm not really going to come up with very much. And in fact, my whole field was in part born by people who were coming to Egypt to try archaeologically or otherwise to prove the Exodus, to excavate Pithom and Ramses to try to find these places and find proof of it. And hieroglyphs were deciphered, and eventually Egyptology developed its own issues and interests in art history and language and grammar and archaeology, and has since sort of moved away from biblical studies in that sense. But of course, it's still an important question. So, is there evidence historically then for Moses and how he could have been raised at court and things like that? Not impossible, but direct evidence, we don't have it. And Ramses, other than these sort of indirect connections, I can't point to anything archaeological that will, in the Egyptian record, material culture, archaeological record, can make this link. There is one famous monument of this king's reign that gets mentioned time and time again. It's probably come up in your reading, and that's this one. It's called the Israel Stela of Merneptah, and this is in the Cairo Museum, and it dates to year 5. It's a victory stela where he mentions different places, Ashkelon, Gezer, and Israel is the big name. And in fact, if you go there today, you may even find the hieroglyphs sort of circled in white chalk for all the tour guides who don't read hieroglyphs but bring their groups and say, look, there's the Israel stela, and there the Israelites are mentioned. So here it is in hieroglyphs, and that actually says in syllabic orthography, Israel. The interesting thing here is at the end, and maybe if I go off camera for a second, you'll see a seated man and a seated woman at the back there, and 3 plural strokes. Our screen is sort of cutting down. So this refers to a people or a tribe. So a seated man, a seated woman, like that, and then plural strokes if you're dealing with a lot of people. If you're dealing with a place name, you would get a different sign at the end of the word, which is basically looking at a traffic intersection. Straight down, you're looking at the intersection of 2 streets. So when I talk about countries or cities or towns, you'll get that determinative, as it's called. It's a picture element that's helping clarify or determine the name. So you'll notice that Israel is not a country, it's not a state in this text, it's a people, it's a tribe, it's a group, and they're listed as being defeated, but that's all there is. There is nothing else to go on here. You do have to ask yourself, if Exodus happened, would the Egyptians have recorded it? Do we really expect to be looking for a source and saying, and then I, Pharaoh, got screwed. And there were plagues, and I didn't know what to do, and I just let them go. Obviously, you're not going to find that in the Egyptian sources. They're not in the habit of posting information about defeats or problems. And in fact, we have to read between the lines in many cases to try to reconstruct, is this a historical event we're reading about? Or is this a topos? Is this one king trying to say, I'm the golden age, before me there was chaos and I made it right? Or is everything in the old days great, or is everything in the old days bad? So historicity becomes a really fascinating topic for debate. So those two kings, that's about it. There's not much in terms of real evidence that I can point to. And of course the Egyptian sources are pretty silent. So I'll just leave you with one other rather provocative author, something to think about here. This gentleman, Jan Asman, is maybe the greatest Egyptologist of all. He's retired now, but that hasn't stopped him writing about a book a week. And he was originally professor in Heidelberg. And years ago, he wrote this book called Moses the Egyptian. He's interested in cultural memory. So not trying to prove historical figures or archaeological record or anything like that. And he traces the monotheism of Moses actually back to the Egyptian 18th dynasty, which others have done before, and in fact to this king, Akhenaten. If you've heard about him before, Akhenaten sort of turns Egyptian religion on its ear. He declares a kind of monotheism. Some people will say that's a very superficial term and shouldn't be used. But he basically worships the sun's disk. And so you'll see he gets his own logo that never occurs at any other time in Egyptian history. It's a round circle of the sun's disk with the rays protruding down and ending in human hands. And so the Aten, or the sun's disk, is the focus of his religion, and he even starts hacking out the names of other hated gods who are in competition. And he and his queen, the famous Nefertiti, become sort of the focal nexus point between the gods, or the god Aten, and the people. So whether you see this as a political move to regroup power around the king, or a genuine religious revolution and a restructuring and a monotheistic approach to what it is to be human and what it is to be alive, all of that surrounds and swirls around Akhenaten's reign. More ink has been spilled on that particular king than any other Egyptian pharaoh. So Asman goes back to Akhenaten and he says that Moses, the monotheism of Moses goes back originally to Akhenaten in Egypt, and then he shows how Moses' followers denied the Egyptians any part in the origin of their beliefs and condemned them as polytheistic idolaters. And so Asman claims that's how began the cycle in which every counter-religion, by establishing itself as truth, denounced all others as false, right? Whatever you believe, that's the true faith, and whatever anyone else believes is not working or somehow misguided. So Asman reconstructs this cycle as a pattern of historical abuse, and he tracks it from the ancient sources, including the Bible, through the Renaissance debate over the basis of religion, and even into Sigmund Freud's Moses and monotheism. So this was a pretty interesting approach, and in fact Asman was attacked basically as if this were an anti-Semitic polemic, when I think instead he was really trying to focus on religion and the us and them kind of dichotomy that developed out of all of this and has led to quite a bit of violence throughout world history. So he wrote a follow-up book to Moses, and this one's called The Price of Monotheism. And he claims it was the Moses of the Hebrew Bible who introduced this true-false distinction in a permanent and revolutionary form. And he argues that the price of this revolution, this monotheistic revolution, has been the exclusion as paganism and heresy of everything deemed incompatible with the truth it proclaims. This exclusion has exploded over and over again into violence, persecution, and he claims with no end in sight. So pretty strong words, pretty provocative. So I have not given you very much archaeological evidence. The reason is there ain't none. Will something come up? I don't know. From the Egyptian sources, it's not the kind of story they're likely to tell, unless you can find it in between the lines.
Thank you, Professor Emanuelian.
My pleasure.
Well, you recall that Professor Kugel in his book discusses at some length this rationalization of miracles, which on the one hand it would seem to, whose goal is to defend the integrity of sacred scripture. On the other hand, fundamentally undoes it, because it turns out the miracle is not a miracle, it wasn't anything special, it was just normal natural processes taking their natural course, which is precisely the opposite of what the Bible is trying to say, which is that these are not natural events, these were spectacularly unnatural events. So there's a paradox there, that by defending scripture you're actually undermining it. Okay, so I'm going to skip my discussion of the historicity of the Exodus. We just heard, fundamentally the point being is that there is no evidence. That's the end of the day, that's the bottom line, right? There is no evidence. So we're left with the biblical narrative, And what we do with it, that's as usual, the usual sets of issues and problems. Just to summarize the big point, most modern Bible scholars would argue that the narrative as we have it is not historical. Again, it's not written by a newspaper reporter chronicling events that he, she, they saw. Rather, it's an ideological narrative, a display of divine power. And possibly, at most, there was some kind of extra story that which some clans, some tribes underwent. And that story of part of the people of Israel became part of the national story of the people of Israel, suitably exaggerated, suitably embroidered, suitably embellished. It became part of the national story, but historically would have been at most a story of part of the people, not all the people. That would be, I think, the standard view of modern Bible scholars, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay, but as I said many times in this class, the historicity is not important. Right, what's important is what does the text mean? What is the text trying to say? Leaving aside questions of historicity, I think we get hung up on that, and then we don't pay attention to the really interesting things. Excuse me. At the end of the day, we don't know whether the narrative is historical or not. But I do have the narrative in front of me. And we can talk about what is the narrative trying to say, what messages it's trying to give. And that's what I want to talk about right now. So we've seen this narrative already before. God is the God of history. God controls human events. God controls natural events, reflecting his will and God's own sense of justice. What's very striking is that the morality, sin, punishment motif, bad guys get punished, good guys get rewarded, is not actually operative here. That is to say, why are the Israelites enslaved in Egypt? Oh, I know, I have the Joseph story, there's a famine, the Israelites come into the land of Canaan, okay, and then the new Pharaoh takes over and enslaves the Israelites. Why does Pharaoh enslave the Israelites? Well, Scripture gives us a human explanation, right? Because he's afraid that the Israelites will become a fifth column, will become a dangerous element in the Egyptian society, threatening society and government. Okay, theologically I'm asking, why does God allow this to happen? Why are the Israelites enslaved for hundreds of years in Egypt? Is it because they're wicked? Is it because their enslavement is condign punishment for their sins? Question mark, class? Anybody can answer me on that one? Is it because they've been wicked and deserve punishment? No. It's very mysterious. This seems to be fated, scripted. Right? God wants the Israelites to be enslaved because, just because. And this goes back to Genesis 15, that in the covenant between the section, God tells Abraham that your descendants, Abraham, will inherit this land. It's not your land now, it belongs to the Canaanites, and the list of tribes is given, Canaanite tribes. In the meantime, they're held by these Canaanite tribes. Your descendants will inherit this land, but not yet. First, they have to go to a land not their own, Egypt, and there be enslaved for 400 years. After that, they will return here and take over this land. That's Genesis 15. Now, if I were Abraham, I would have said, God, why do my descendants have to suffer so? 400 years of enslavement in a land not their own. Well, our forefather Abraham forgot to ask that question, so God gets away with it. So the Israelites are enslaved for 400 years. This is a very striking motif. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, why the narrator depicts it this way, but it is a motif we will see elsewhere in the Hebrew Scriptures, where on the national level, on the global level, the cosmic level, God is often depicted as acting mysteriously and as if we are controlled by fate. The fate comes from God. It's not Greek, where it's not where the fate is in opposition to Zeus. No, faith and God are the same thing. But God often acts in mysterious ways. This is a classic example of that here. Okay, so the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt for reasons known to God and God only. They're there for a long period of time, 400 years in one text, 430 years in another text, 210 years according to rabbinic chronology. And then they escape with the Exodus. And of course we have here a spectacular display of divine power. And any of you who go to a Passover Seder know that we celebrate the 10 plagues. Why do we need so many plagues? Why don't we just drop the atom bomb and get it over with? You know, why this dramatic buildup? First this, then that, then this, and that. And finally we get to the plague of the death of the firstborn, until finally, Pharaoh says, enough! He rapidly changes his mind, however, setting us up for the even more spectacular display of divine power at the splitting of the sea, a news clip of which we saw previously. So why does God need all those plagues? Why doesn't God just start off with the death of the firstborn? Or as I said, just drop the atom bomb and get it over with and then leave. Well, again, the text does not answer this question. Apparently, we like the fact we have here multiple opportunities for God to display power. And indeed, according to the narrative, both the Israelites and the Egyptians alike need to be impressed by divine power. Both of them need to be brought to their attention that this is a powerful God. You don't mess with this God. This is a common motif throughout these plagues chapters, and also in the Passover ritual, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Right, the ritual about Passover, where we're told over and over again, there's a didactic function. Your child will ask you, why do we do all these things? And your reply is, because God redeemed us with a mighty arm, a mighty hand, an outstretched arm from the land of Egypt. So in Israel's historical memory, this is a formative moment. Right? This is the moment in which Israel recognizes God. And how does Israel recognize God? Answer, God puts on a spectacular sound and light show. So Israel comes to acknowledge God and God's power, and also Pharaoh. Pharaoh too needs to be taught that this God is a God you don't mess with. Now what's interesting here is that the narrator wants Pharaoh to recognize God. And Pharaoh is obstreperous, Pharaoh resistant, until finally he cannot deny what is obvious. Namely, this is a powerful God, and he must yield. Does that mean Pharaoh becomes an Israelite? Does that mean Pharaoh, by acknowledging the power of Israel's God, has, quote, converted? No, the narrator knows how to distinguish. There are Gentiles, to use a later word. There are non-Israelites who will acknowledge the power of Israel's God. And that's a good thing. But at the end of the day, they're not Israelites. At the end of the day, they're still polytheists. At the end of the day, the Egyptian Pharaoh is still an Egyptian Pharaoh. His Egyptian courtiers are still Egyptian. They're going to worship all their gazillion gods. I don't know how many are there, but gazillion, more or less. Many, many gods. They remain Egyptian. Here's a motif we will see again throughout the Hebrew Bible, where that the God imposes a system of morality on the world. All nations are obligated to observe this system of morality, even non-Israelites. Israelites have a special set of rules that apply only to them, but the whole series of rules apply to all of humanity, and God will punish non-Israelites also for violating those rules, and in return, God demands that these non-Israelites will observe these fundamental norms of piety, morality, and justice. In this case, combined with the recognition that these rules in fact come from God. It is God, the Israelite God, who is imposing the system of order. So we have a two-tier system. Israelites owe exclusive loyalty to God. Right? Israel is not allowed to sleep around, to use the marriage metaphor of the prophets. Whereas the non-Israelites, they need to recognize the power of Israel's God, and apparently that's all we expected. Okay, we'll come back to this point again in later texts. We talk about, again, the prophets who critique the nations. Prophets like Isaiah, Amos, Jeremiah, they're not just yelling at the Israelites, they're also yelling at non-Israelites. But the goal is not to make them into Israelites, the goal is not to make them convert. Their goal, rather, is to bring them to an awareness of the demands of morality and justice. Okay. Exodus chapter 12. History of the Pesach, or the Passover sacrifice. This is our first legal text class, chapter 12. It's a text full of ritual rules and laws, generally speaking ascribed to P, our priestly source. What's going on in the Passover sacrifice? Remember, if you watch the movie The Ten Commandments, right, you slaughter a lamb, you sprinkle the blood on the doorposts of your house, tent, you huddle inside while the destroyer, that's the word used, the destroyer is out loose, killing the firstborn of the Egyptians. So there is no Egyptian house that does not have a dead in it. It says, Ein bayit asher ein sham met. There is no house without a corpse, except among the Israelites who are protected by the blood of the paschal sacrifice. That's the story. That's what it says. Now, what is going on in this story is very hard to fathom or detect. Our assumption is that this, lurking beneath this all, is an apotropaic set of rituals. Apotropaic, another nice word, right? Rituals designed to avert danger, turn back danger, to be protective. Avert is Latin, apotropaic is Greek, it means the same thing. Turning back, turning aside. So behind this story of the death of the Egyptian firstborn and the saving of the Israelite firstborn is the power of the blood of the paschal lamb. Surely, lurking deep beneath the subterranean chambers here is some kind of substitution. Once upon a time we sacrificed our firstborn. Remember the Akedah story, Genesis 22. We don't do that anymore. God still taxed the firstborn. There's something lurking here on that score, where behind the Passover ritual and the blood manipulation, the slaughter of the lamb, we slaughter the lamb because we don't slaughter the firstborn. Anyway, this is the way it's commonly understood. The text gets very complicated, though, with trying to mix in both the historical setting in Egypt, at the same time combining it with a 7-day matzah festival. Matzah festival to eat unleavened bread in the spring. What does that have to do with the blood manipulation and the protection of the firstborn? Well, the text tries to connect them. The Israelites were in a big hurry. They had to leave Egypt in a big hurry. They didn't have time for the bread to rise. You know, if you set your bread machine to bread, it takes typically 3 hours and 30 minutes to get a loaf of bread. But they didn't have time. They had to hurry up. The Egyptians were saying, go, go, go. So the Israelites had to leave in a hurry. Therefore, they had unleavened bread. Maybe that's a satisfactory explanation for you, but most of us would say that's not. There's something else going on here. So it seems to be a combination of this sacrifice, the blood of the lamb, festival, protection of the firstborn festival, combined with a 7-day spring matzah festival, and somehow these come together in some very mysterious way. Yes?
There was a question about the nature of the firstborn. Was
Yes.
it just firstborn males, or were females included in this?
Excellent question. The text says firstborn and suggests it's males. Right, it suggests it's males. I believe there is some discussion in rabbinic midrash about this point. What if the house does not have a firstborn male? Well, then you get to firstborn, but ultimately they think would be a firstborn female also. But that's the rabbinic reading. I believe the text would strongly suggest it says firstborn male.
The question was posed further. What if the daughter is older than the sons?
That's not a firstborn male. I'm just going by what it says, right? I have no inside information here, except that that's what it says. Right, this sounds like it's males. Okay, good question. I don't have a full answer to that one. Read the text carefully and see whether you think firstborn females would have been included. I think they would have been, as females generally were, invisible in that culture. Okay, 1 minute left. Exodus 15, Song of the Sea. Spectacular song, just as like Genesis 49, where our assumption is that the narrator has before him an old song, which is a freestanding, independent composition, which is inserted into the narrative. The story is a story, and then we have this poem which antedates the story, and in some extent may even be inconsistent with the story. Right? That's what we have in Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea. It is a spectacular song. If you read very carefully, and Kugel and various other people argue that it's not entirely consistent with the prose narrative that precedes it. That, of course, it depends on interpretation. You can make it consistent if you want to make it consistent. If you don't want to, of course, the song seems to be an alternative version of the events described in the previous chapter. Okay, everybody, our time is up. Have a great weekend, and thank you again, Professor Emanuele.
Okay. Let me struggle here for a minute. Oh, Dale, you made it. Good.
Yes, I did. Thank you. Interesting.
There. Okay. So I will. Let people try to unmute people here. All set, all set. Okay. So you should be able to speak if you're so inclined. Did anybody hear anything that was particularly surprising? Has everybody seen the 10 Commandments?
Yeah.
Yes.
I've never seen it start to finish.
Oh, it's worth the effort. It's
Yeah, well, I try. I'm not always successful.
actually it's interesting because they conflate a number of the different stories, especially about the disobedience in the desert stuff. So that, for instance, and this was today, the text for today that was read at morning prayer talks about where the earth opened up and swallowed up some dissidents that Moses was dealing with. But in the movie, they actually had that in response to the golden calf, which is earlier in the narrative. So the movie conflates some of those things. I don't know if you might have seen him briefly. Edward G. Robinson was the villain of the story, so to speak. So he passed by, but he actually appears in the text. He doesn't appear as much as he does in the movie, and he has more of a backstory than he did in the text. So as I said, I would suggest it. It's an interesting piece also for what it reflects about the times it was made. So that's another whole deal.
Robinson is a tax collector, right?
What?
In the 10 Commandment, he's a tax collector.
I think he's like a flunky for the Pharaoh.
Yeah.
He's like an overseer. He's kind of Moses's sort of nemesis, if you will. But he is an Israelite, so he has to leave with the rest of them.
Yeah.
So does the question of the historicity, I mean, the fact is, and I've mentioned our oldest son, Mark, was an archaeologist, and we talked about this a bit. And, there's probably as much evidence for the existence of Moses as there was for King Arthur. And Mark actually said, well, it's probably actually more for King Arthur.
I was going to say, I think Arthur wins that one.
Yeah. Now I read some of there are a number of scholars who believe that there was a Moses like figure, who may have been given all these mythic sort of, capabilities as time went on. But the important thing, I guess, is really, and again, myth here doesn't mean it's not true. Myth just means that there's an element in the national story about what makes them Jews or what makes them Israelites, that's one of their stories. And, kind of like, as I go back to like the rite of Paul Revere is for us.
I still am totally confused about Passover. I thought he was going to explain the whole thing, and I'm worse off now for what he.
Oh, okay. So Passover
I
and
know the
actually
whole
in the,
story.
yeah, we'll go into a lot more depth in the second part of the course where we'll talk about the origins of Passover or Pesha. But in summary, what he sees in Passover, and what he's not alone, but what Passover is actually what you have is two traditions that have come together. There is the sacrifice of the lamb, and that is believed to have originated in a spring, going out to the hill, taking your sheep out to the pasture. And so there was,
Oh, wait a minute.
so there's a theory that this was originally a rite of sacrificing one of the sheep to ward off like evil spirits and wolves and stuff like that. So that's one piece. Then there was also the unleavened bread. There was also a festival of unleavened bread. And the two of those got conflated with each other. And then they, when he was talking about the story about, why they had to leave in a hurry, and they made up the story, or there is the story about, they had to leave in a hurry. So that's why they had unleavened bread and they couldn't wait for the bread to rise. So that's attributing it really, the unleavened, that's attributing it to something that happened later. So, but he'll go in a lot more detail when he discusses that in the second part of the course, where he'll talk about the comparisons and the origins of the Pesha and also its connections with the Eucharist.
So it seems like to me, as I listen, really the whole thing about Exodus and the Passover, all this, since there's no evidence in Egypt history, and archaeologically nothing, this could very well be a lot of oral history among the Jews.
That's true. I mean, if you look, our stories about Jesus really started as oral history, which eventually were written down quite a few years after he died or departed the earth. However, so I think that's probably a similar. So, and there are some people oral traditions we passed on, and there are some people anthropologists make the argument that they can be reasonably accurate, but that's a good point. I did want to go back to epotropaic was one of those $5 words he threw around. That's just keep them. That just means doing something to ward off evil spirits. So throw that around the Christmas table.
I was I suppose it's because of the time of the year that we are in, but I was thinking of Jesus coming out of Egypt, the flight into Egypt, and whether that is history, and then thinking about the position of Egypt in history during all of the time that the country in Canaan was being developed.
Well, in the second part, Egypt, when you're Israel, Judah and Israel back then, they were a small, weak country who got trumped over a lot. So frequently they were always looking for stronger sponsors, if you will, which would either be Egypt or wherever, Babylon or to the north. So Egypt was always, I think, traditionally considered a place of refuge.
Well, I was wondering whether it's like the wilderness. We understand the wilderness either to be a place to be feared or a place to go to develop. It is going into the wilderness like John the Baptist did. That's a good thing that he was in the wilderness. Whereas when Jesus was tempted, the wilderness was a bad thing. And then relating to Egypt. So if you're in Egypt to be safe,
from your enemies, or if you are in Egypt and being oppressed as slaves. It goes both ways. Which is it?
I don't know. That could be actually goes back to the problem that he highlighted is why were the Israelites enslaved, really?
Yeah.
I mean, in later stories, sometimes you'll hear they got taken off the Babylon because they were idolatry, committed sins. But in this case, they at least don't. There's nothing in the text to indicate they did anything particularly wrong. But they had to be in some sort of hardship in order to be delivered from it. I think the wilderness experience, you see that in a lot of stories when you look at the various protagonists in the story, and frequently there is this sort of experience where they go off into the wilderness, like Paul. At least there's some evidence that suggests he spent quite a few years, like in Arabia or somewhere, studying. Right? Didn't he go away for a while?
Yeah. A period.
So he went off and was studying, and I mean, we say this. I think the text says the Spirit drove Jesus into the wilderness, and so and part of that, was part of a sort of an endurance test, I suppose, or a sort of an endurance to strengthen one. But that's really sort of a standard story with a lot of different. When you look at a lot of stories of different heroes, there's often this wilderness experience where they go and are tested before they go off and on their mission.
I was just thinking that when we hear the story of Mary and Joseph taking the baby down to Egypt, it was safety to be protected.
Yeah, and at least in Matthew, a lot of that really is really could be representing Jesus as sort of the new Moses, or the successor to Moses. That's the word I want. Because it does say, the Matthew text says, this is to fulfill the prophecy that he came out of Egypt.
So when I'm looking at this, and it's really fascinating how it's kind of turned upside down. So you have it's almost like a side story when I think about the lineage from Abraham to Jesus, and you then have Moses coming in when I guess Joseph is the reason the Israelites end up in Egypt or near Egypt. Is that right? And then they're saying there's no evidence. And then it's for such a historic event to be so important to the faith of the Jewish people that could have likely been developed as a symbolic, or some kind of story to make. I always think of the politics of religion. How do you bring people into a more the 10 Commandments? They really start to say these are the codes of behavior. There is God. So I don't know. I just start to think about this in a way that's very different than how I've thought about it until tonight.
Well, going to actually, something Mary said about, the season we're in, because we celebrate God coming into the world. That's what Christmas is all about. And Professor Cohen brought this up, but the two poles that the Israelite Jewish religion rests on, one is God the Creator, and the other is a God who is active in the world.
Yeah.
And their primary example, the primary example, and you will see, and actually, as when you read the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, when you read that, they always will return to the Exodus. They will, when they talk of God fulfilling His promises, typically it's either as God the Creator or God who delivered them from Egypt and the wicked Pharaoh and all that. So it's, for them, God is active in the world, and this is their primary story that shows that. And much of the Hebrew Bible really comes back to this story.
Yep.
And I think for the Jews of Jesus' time, probably this was still their central story. In fact, it was. And so I think it probably, if you were a Jesus follower, I think you would try to make that connection. At least if, say, Matthew was trying to make that connection. The other gospel writers might have had different sort of audiences they're writing for.
Right.
But
That's really interesting.
Not to say anything too much, but aren't we missing a bunch that happened in between here, between the Exodus? Weren't the people scattered? Because of the purpose that the Egyptians at first thought that they were getting too large. They were going to take them into captivity.
Well, they went to Egypt. They followed Joseph. They came to Egypt with Joseph, and then they multiplied.
Right.
And then Pharaoh said, "Well, there's going to be too many of them, and they could be in trouble." So they enslaved them, and then they suffer, and so eventually Moses goes off and then comes back as a deliverer. God commands him to take them out of Egypt. So what's the interim period you're talking about?
Well, it seems like we missed a portion in here where he's saying that why were the people, they had no evidence, but then the first professor said that the Egyptians were a proud people and they weren't going to write anything down or keep track of anything that made them look less. So now you put that into play. So who's to say it wasn't true if it's going to make them look shallow or less?
No, you're absolutely right. There's still the historicity of Moses is a debatable topic. I mean, it's you can't say for certain either he existed or didn't exist.
For other classes that, I mean, in history of the Bible and that I've at least taken, it also tells us that that's the way things happened in that time of the world where it was all in translation. Nothing was ever written down. It was story told the story told the story. And it's just like today, when I'm going to tell a story to you, it's going to change by the time it gets to the fifth person down the line. So you've either added to it or you've taken away.
My wife says I do that all the time.
You enhance.
I make it better.
Yeah, enhancement. Yeah. But that's, I mean, today we have microphones and we have tape recorders and everything, and we can tape everything and we can take pictures. Back then they had their vision and they had, to where they didn't have scribes until, when the Gospels came, then they had scribes more or less to write the history, but now it's just voice. It's from one person's idea and vision to another's.
Then sometimes you lose some of the meaning even, and
right,
or even context.
Because family history is done the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I mean, that's always.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done some genealogy, and I've learned never just because it's in the obituary doesn't mean it's right.
That's correct.
or just because it's even if it's on a tombstone, I've discovered tombstones are wrong. So just because it's carved in stone doesn't mean it's true. So
I would say this has had an impact on me more than anything we've looked at before in terms of is it all just a lesson? Is it just a folk story to say what the Jewish history means to them? So I have to adjust my thinking. I never thought it was strict history, but I never doubted there was a Moses.
Well, and I don't know that they're suggesting for sure there wasn't either. Like Anita said, I don't think that we can say there wasn't of Moses either. And I'm not, it's kind of those things, why would you make up a story like this to begin with? I mean, it's a pretty, there must be some, I mean, that alone would suggest there must be something to it, because it's a pretty wild story. And so why, so why would you make that up unless
I believe as we travel further through our lessons and our learning of the Torah and of the Old Testament, we're going to find that some of this is going to tie in later. Yeah. It'll all tie back in.
Mhm.
I think there's places in the New Testament that speak of the Old Testament. So,
Yeah. Oh, sure.
So that it has to be some legitimate writing somewhere.
Well, it was important. The historical fact was it was important to them. That is not, that you can't argue about. These were important stories to them. And I'm not even sure the historicity was as important as the lessons of the story.
I was just going to mention that the lesson, what you learned from these experiences of what we're reading or they're talking about is big. If you put it to everyday life, you see something you've learned from it.
Like, I always go back, for instance, to the Good Samaritan, the story of the Good Samaritan. I mean, nobody's ever argued that there really was a Good Samaritan, or that there, or that it happened. But the point is that there's a truth in that story, because what was Jesus asked? Jesus asked, "Who's my neighbor?" So that's what he told the story, and then at the end he said, "Who was the man's neighbor?" So even though the historicity of the story really never comes into play, there is a truth in that story.
Absolutely.
Now, the Canaanites, I'll call them, actually did go down into Egypt, did they?
Don't know.
Right, this is it.
We don't know, but we don't know that they didn't either.
Right.
I mean, these were fairly nomadic populations, so they kind of moved around a lot.
And the idea that God delivered them, whatever their situation was, they were delivered and given a land. That was their view of history. That's what they believed about themselves, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Is there any evidence where they were in Mount Sinai, the Sinai desert, where they spent 40 years?
Wandering.
Not real. Well, the problem is that the numbers in Scripture make that questionable, because if you read all the thousands and thousands of people, that slept across the desert and camped out, they should have left something behind, and they haven't. They haven't found anything yet.
Okay.
Doesn't mean they won't.
Right.
And if these people were not in Egypt, where were they hanging out? That's my question.
Well, and the Exodus, we picture it like in the Ten Commandments. It could have been a much more, they sort of marched along. It could have been a much more gradual sort of migration.
Yeah.
Maybe like the Americans when they went west. They sort of went in dribs and drabs.
Okay.
So when they trace the lineage from Abraham to Jesus, and they go through, Jacob and then the sons and the tribes, and so during that Exodus period, they should have some of those descendants having been a part of that Exodus, right?
Yeah, although I don't have those in my head. There's two genealogies, and they're actually different. One's in, help me, Mary.
And
because one actually goes through Mary, and the other, Mary, Blessed Virgin, and the other one goes through Joseph.
Joseph. So this would be Joseph, I think. Is that the one that
I would have to look at him.
David, yeah. But I was just curious. So you have this, and sorry, I'm misanalytical, I'm probably overthinking this. So after, Jacob and then Joseph, and then you have the 12 tribes, then they have kids that lived in Egypt, most likely. So they would have been part of this whole Exodus period, and then moved through that into David, and then continued on and on, right? They have the names of everybody, basically.
Right. Yeah. I don't have those names in front of me. I'll have to look at that.
No, I know, but I'm just thinking out loud that they don't lose a period of time through Joseph to David. There's always these names, right? Okay.
Yeah. There should be some names. I'd have to look up, find out which they are.
Yeah. Just
Yeah,
curious.
because I know Jesus is actually identified to a certain tribe, as is David.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to say it's the tribe of Benjamin, but I'm not sure.
Okay. I think the hard thing is we all try to make it fit. I try to make it fit into a very easily understandable story and I guess that's what faith is about, being able to understand the words of God, however they were delivered, versus having facts about the actual characters.
Mhm.
Well, we're seeing different, and when you have the Gospels, for instance, like you have two different genealogies, one's in Luke, one's in Matthew. You get different pictures. It's like that old story about the blind man trying to describe the elephant kind of thing. You've got different perspectives of it. So I think you're just getting different pictures of Jesus, and they're emphasizing different things about Jesus that they think are important for wherever their audience is. Like for Matthew, the audience was a Jewish audience. For Luke, it might have been more of a Gentile audience. Okay. So we will reconvene next week. It was a good discussion. Thank you.
And I will try to be on time. So
Right.
I'll be on time next week.
Oh, okay. We got you in.
Yes, thank you.
No, sorry about that.
Well, I was watching the news and I fell asleep, to be honest. And I said,
Well, that should be a lesson to you. Don't watch the news.
You're right. You're right. I'll remember that. Okay. Good night, all.
Good night,
Good night.
everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.